The canyon walls pressed in like the jaws of some ancient beast, sandstone, scorched white under a merciless noon sun that turned the air thick as molten glass. Hazel Whitcomb's boots slid in loose gravel with each staggering step, her balance a precarious negotiation between forward momentum and collapse. Coda's weight draped across her shoulders, his arm slung over her neck, his hand limp against her ribs, where 7 months of pregnancy had already pushed her body to its limits. She could feel the wet heat of his blood, seeping through the buckskin of his shirt and onto the torn cotton of her chemise, sticky and warm, a constant reminder that time was running out for both of them. Her belly pressed hard against the strain, the baby inside, shifting restlessly as if sensing the danger. Hazel locked her knees with each step, grinding her teeth against the pain shooting up her spine, because stopping meant dying, and she'd be damned if she'd let that happen. Not after everything. Not after Teodoro. The distant crack of rifle fire echoed off the stone, sharp and flat, the sound bouncing between the narrow walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Hoofbeats thundered somewhere behind them, growing steadily louder, and Hazel's breath came in ragged gasps that tasted of copper and grit. Dust rose in thick plumes, choking the slot canyon, and she squinted against it, her eyes burning. Coda's head lolled against her shoulder, his black hair matted with sweat and sand and blood. But his eyes cracked open dark and fierce despite the blood loss, and his voice came out rough as sandpaper. Left. Shadow under the wall. Hazel glanced sideways and saw at a narrow cleft in the rock face a sliver of darkness where the canyon bent sharply. She adjusted her grip on him, feeling the tremor in his muscles, and lurched toward it. A bullet kicked up sand 3 feet to her right, or the impact a sharp hiss followed by the whine of a ricochet, and she swallowed the scream that clawed at her throat. The baby kicked hard inside her, a sharp jab of protest that made her gasp, and she pressed one hand to her belly as she wedged them both into the cleft. The space was barely wide enough for 2 bodies. Hazel's back scraped against rough sandstone, and Coda's chest pressed against her shoulder, his breath hot and shallow against her ear. She could feel the rapid, irregular thump of his heartbeat through the thin layers of fabric between them. Too fast, too weak. The posse thundered past, so close she could hear the creak of leather saddles, the jangle of spurs, the low curses of men who hunted for sport and bounty. Dust clouded the air so thick she could barely make out their shapes, dark silhouettes against the blinding light. Hazel held her breath until her lungs screamed, her hand still on her belly where the baby had gone still and tense. Coda's hand, hot trembling, covered hers. Not a gesture of comfort, but a wordless acknowledgement that bound them together. We share this now. Survive or die together. The dust began to settle slowly, filtering down in lazy spirals. The hoofbeats faded into the distance, swallowed by the canyon's endless twists and turns. Hazel exhaled in a long, shuddering release, her lungs burning with the effort, and tilted her head to look at Coda. His eyes were half closed, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. But he nodded once. A single deliberate motion that said, "Move now." She shifted her weight carefully, easing them out of the cleft, and he leaned on her again, heavier this time. His blood dripped onto the pale sand, dark drops that spread and darkened. And Hazel felt the cold edge of fear slide up her spine like a blade. They had no water, no real shelter, and no allies in these canyons. Just heatstone and the men who wanted them dead. But she set her jaw, adjusted her grip on his waist, and started walking. Because survival was all they had left, and she'd be damned twice over if she'd give it up now. Behind them, far enough to feel like temporary safety, but close enough to keep the fear sharp, she heard a shout. Tracks fresh blood. They didn't get far. Hazel's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Coda, and he looked back, and in that shared glance was everything they couldn't afford to say aloud. They moved deeper into the stone maze, leaving a trail they couldn't hide, and the sun beat down without mercy. 2 days earlier, Hazel had arrived in the frontier town of Red Rock, perched on the back of a freight wagon, one battered trunk, and a single carpetbag, her only possessions. The town sprawled low and dusty at the edge of the canyon country, a rough collection of weathered clapboard buildings and sun-bleached canvas tents clustered around what used to be a river, but was now little more than a dry bed of cracked mud and scattered stones. The sun hammered down with the weight of a blacksmith's anvil, and Hazel felt every mile of the journey in her aching back, her swollen ankles, and the persistent throb in her temples. She was 28 years old, a widow 6 months gone and pregnant with a child her late husband, Teodoro Whitcomb, would never meet. Teodoro had been a bookkeeper at Copper Gulch Mine, a quiet man with ink-stained fingers, wire-rimmed spectacles, and a conscience that had gotten him killed. He'd been shot in the street one cold March night, 3 bullets to the chest, and the town's sheriff had ruled it a robbery, despite the fact that Teodoro's pocket watch, his wallet with $4 in silver, and his wedding ring had all been left untouched on his body. Hazel knew better. She'd found the ledger, hidden in the false bottom of his desk drawer the day after the funeral, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and bound with twine gone brittle with age. The pages recorded illegal payments made to Sheriff Conrad Pike and Mine Superintendent Alphonse Lemaire bribes to divert Elk-Eye Spring, the water source that fed Red Rock's struggling farms, directly into the mine's stamp mills and sluices. Each entry was meticulous dates, amounts, initials. And on the last page, folded carefully, was a hand-drawn map of the canyon system, with a red triangle marking something labeled simply Overflow. Beneath it, in Teodoro's careful script, Kay showed me. Pike was listening. Must tell more. Now she carried that ledger sewn into the hem of her dress, the pages stitching into the wool like secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. The weight of it pressed against her hip with every step, a constant reminder of why she'd come and what she risked. The wagon driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth who'd asked no questions, dropped her at the boarding house, a 2-story structure with peeling yellow paint and a narrow porch sagging under its own weight. Hazel paid him the last of her coin and dragged her trunk inside her arms, trembling with the effort. The landlady, a stout woman named Mrs. Callahan, with suspicious eyes and flour-dusted hands, looked her up and down, lingering on her swollen belly, but took her money without comment and showed her to a room overlooking the dusty street. Hazel locked the door, sat on the narrow bed with its thin mattress and faded quilt, and stared at the wall. She needed allies. Trustworthy people who wouldn't sell her to Pike or Lemaire for a handful of silver. But trust was a scarce commodity in a town where water meant the difference between survival and ruin, and silence meant staying alive. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon and the heat finally began to ease, she ventured to the general store. The proprietor, a balding man named Silas Yates, with nervous hands and a habit of licking his lips, weighed out her flour and bacon with quick, jerky movements. His eyes kept flicking to the window, to the street, to the door, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Hazel kept her voice casual, friendly. "Seems like a quiet town." Yates barked a short, humorless laugh. "Quiet as a graveyard, and just as dead if the mine keeps stealing our water." "Who runs things here?" Yates's hands stilled for just a moment, then resumed their nervous work. "Sheriff Pike, Mine Superintendent Lemaire. They run everything that matters." He paused, then added in a lower voice, "But there's some who resist. Dr. Moore treats the sick on credit, speaks his mind. Miss Josephine Hart at the schoolhouse teaches farm children to read, even though Lemaire wants her to stop. Robert Haskett out on the East Road, his land's dying, but he won't give up." Hazel filed the names away carefully. "And the sheriff, is he honest?" Yates looked at her, then really looked, and something flickered in his eyes, fear or maybe calculation. "Honest as any lawman in these parts, I reckon." He wrapped her purchases in brown paper, tied it with string, and pushed it across the counter. That'll be 60 cents. Hazel paid and left, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Yates had been weighing her words, measuring her intentions. She filed that away too, a small warning bell in the back of her mind. As she passed the saloon, a low building with bat-wing doors and the sour smell of whiskey and unwashed men drifting out, she heard voices. She paused outside the window, hidden by the shadows, and the failing light, and listened. Lakota shot just outside town. One man said, his voice rough with drink. Fled into the canyons. Pike posted a bounty, $500 dead or alive. What did he do? Another asked. Pike says he stole a horse after a scrap with mine guards. A third voice, quieter and more sober, cut in. Moore says that's a lie. Says the man was defending himself. Says Pike's trying to silence him. Silence him for what? Don't know. But Moore don't lie. Hazel's pulse quickened. A Lakota man hunted by Pike. She filed that away too, another piece of the puzzle she was slowly assembling. She returned to the boarding house and lay awake in the narrow bed, listening to the wind rattle the shutters and feeling the baby shift and turn inside her. Tomorrow she would find Dr. Moore. The next morning arrived with a kind of brightness that hurt the eyes, the sky, a hard, cloudless blue. Hazel walked to the edge of town where Dr. Franklin Moore's office sat beside the livery stable. A small cabin with a weathered shingle nailed above the door. Moore was in the yard, tending a mule with a swollen hoof, and he straightened when he saw her approach. He was 50 years old, lean and graying, with a face weathered by sun and hard years, and eyes that missed nothing. "You're Whitcomb's widow," he said. Not a question, but a statement delivered with the calm certainty of a man who knew the town's secrets. Hazel nodded. "I need to speak with people I can trust." Moore glanced over her shoulder, checking the street, then gestured toward the cabin. Inside. The office smelled of carbolic acid leather and dried herbs. Shelves lined the walls cluttered with bottles and jars, rolls of bandages, and a few battered medical texts. Moore closed the door firmly and leaned against the examination table, crossing his arms. "What do you need?" Hazel hesitated for only a moment, then decided to risk it. "My husband kept records. I think they're why he died." Moore's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You think Pike killed him?" "I know he did, or had it done." Moore exhaled slowly through his nose, then nodded. "Teodoro came to see me the night before he died. Said a Lakota scout had shown him something important at the spring, proof that the mine was stealing water. Said he'd take it to the town meeting and force Pike's hand. I told him to wait, to be careful, to let me help him build a case first. He wouldn't listen. He was too angry, too determined. And the next morning, he was dead." Hazel's throat tightened, grief and anger warring inside her. "Who was the scout?" "Lakota man named Coda. Been trading pelts in town for years. Good man, honest. He saw what the mine was doing and warned Teodoro. But Pike found out somehow, accused Coda of horse theft, and set bounty hunters on him. Where is he now?" Moore's eyes narrowed. "Out in the canyons, shot from what I heard. If he's still alive, he won't be for long. Whiskey Tom's on his trail, and Tom doesn't stop until he collects." Hazel stood, her decision made. "I need to find him." Moore frowned, his eyes dropping to her swollen belly. "You're 7 months along. You can't go out there in your condition. I can't stay here either. If Pike knows I'm alive and asking questions, I'm as good as dead." Moore studied her for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "You're as stubborn as your husband was. Fine. But you'll need help. Talk to Miss Josephine Hart at the schoolhouse. She's smart and she's got backbone. And talk to Robert Haskett on the East Road. His farm's dying because of the water theft. He'll help if he can." Hazel thanked him and left. She found Josephine Hart at the schoolhouse, a tidy building with whitewashed walls and rows of rough wooden benches. Josephine was 35, slender and sharp-eyed, with dark hair pinned back severely, and ink stains on her fingers that matched Moore's description. She listened to Hazel's story without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each passing minute. When Hazel finished, Josephine nodded slowly. My father was a railroad operator before he died. He taught me Morse code when I was a girl. There's a telegraph key in the post office, and the clerk's a fool who leaves the office unattended for lunch every day. If we need to send a message quietly, I can do it. Hazel felt a flicker of hope, small but real. Thank you. Josephine's smile was faint but warm. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when we're all still breathing. That afternoon, Hazel walked the 2 miles to Robert Haskett's farm, under the brutal sun, her feet aching and her back throbbing with every step. The land was dying. The fields were cracked and barren, the irrigation ditches dry as bone, the few remaining crops withered and brown. Haskett was 40, broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, with a face lined by worry and hard labor. His wife and 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, watched from the porch as Hazel explained what she knew and what she suspected. Haskett's expression grew grimmer with each word. When she finished, he looked out at his dying land, then back at his family. We've been dying slow out here, he said, his voice rough. Pike and Lemaire cut the water to fill their sluices, and we're left with dust and rocks. We lose the spring, we lose everything. Our land, our home, our future. Then help me stop them, Hazel said quietly. Haskett looked at his wife, who nodded once her face set. He turned back to Hazel. What do you need? A safe place if things go wrong, and a wagon if it comes to running. Haskett extended his hand, calloused and strong. You got it. They shook, and Hazel felt the alliance settle into place, fragile but real. That evening, back in her room at the boarding house, Hazel heard more whispers from the saloon. The Lakota man had been spotted near the canyon mouth, wounded and alone. Pike had doubled the bounty to $700. Whiskey Tom and his men were tracking him, and they were closing in. Hazel made her decision. She would find Coda, the man who tried to help her husband, and together they would bring Pike and Lemaire down. She packed light, a canteen, a small knife, a shawl, some strips of cloth for bandages, and slipped out before dawn, heading into the canyons alone. The canyon country opened before her like a wound in the earth, red stone walls rising steep and jagged on either side. The air was still cool in the pre-dawn darkness. But Hazel knew the heat would come fast and brutal once the sun climbed above the rim. She walked carefully, testing each step, her boots crunching on loose gravel and sand. She carried the ledger in a leather satchel slung across her body, too valuable to leave behind, and its weight pressed against her hip with every movement. She followed the dry creek bed, deeper into the stone maze, scanning the ground for signs of passage. Boot prints, scuff marks, anything. The canyon twisted and turned, narrowing in places, until she had to edge sideways, her pregnant belly brushing against the rough rock. Sweat dampened her collar, despite the cool air, and her breath came harder with each step. An hour after sunrise, she found him. Coda lay half-buried under a clump of sagebrush sand piled against his legs and torso, as if he'd tried to dig himself in for cover against the cold night. His buckskin shirt was stiff with dried blood, and his face was pale beneath the dust and sweat. An old arrow scar marked his left shoulder, white and puckered with age. But the fresh rifle wound in his side was still weeping blood. His eyes opened as she approached, dark and wary, tracking her movement, and his hand moved instinctively toward the beaded knife sheathed at his belt. Hazel stopped 3 paces away and raised her hands slowly, palms out, in a gesture of peace. I can extract the bullet or leave you to the sun. Choose fast. Coda stared at her, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. His eyes flicked to her belly, then back to her face, calculating. Then his hand fell away from the knife, and he nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. Hazel knelt beside him in the sand, setting the satchel carefully aside. She'd watched Dr. Moore work often enough during Teodoro's final illness to know the basics of field medicine. She pulled a small awl from her satchel, something Teodoro had used for leather work, and heated the tip over a lucifer match until it glowed faintly. She wet a strip of cloth from her canteen and looked at Coda. "This is going to hurt. Badly." Coda pulled a strip of rawhide from his belt and clamped it between his teeth, his jaw setting. Hazel used her knife to cut open his shirt, exposing the wound. The bullet had gone in clean just below the ribs on his left side, but it had lodged deep. She took a breath to steady herself, then probed carefully with the heated awl. Coda's entire body went rigid, every muscle tensing, and sweat beaded instantly on his forehead and jaw dripping onto her wrist where she braced against his skin. But he didn't cry out, didn't make a sound beyond the harsh rasp of his breathing through clenched teeth. She worked as quickly as she dared, feeling the metal tip catch and slide against bone and tissue. Finally, mercifully, it caught the edge of the bullet and levered it free. The small piece of lead clinked onto the sand beside them, dark with blood. Hazel immediately pressed the wet cloth hard against the wound to staunch the bleeding. "Hold this," she said, guiding his hand to the cloth. He obeyed his hand, shaking slightly, his breath hissing between his teeth. Hazel tore long strips from her already tattered petticoat and bound the wound tightly, layering the cloth and tying it securely. When she finished, their heads were close together under the sparse shade of the sagebrush, their breaths mingling in the rising heat. "Why?" Coda asked, his voice rough as gravel. Hazel sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "The men hunting you wear the same brand as those who killed my husband." Coda's eyes narrowed, sharpening with understanding. "Whitcomb?" "Yes." He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "You're his wife." "Widow?" He nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his expression. "I showed your husband the spring, the real source. Pike found out somehow. I didn't know he was listening." Hazel felt a chill despite the rising heat. "You were the scout Moore mentioned." "I was." She wanted to ask more how Pike had found out what exactly Teodoro had discovered, but the faint sound of hoofbeats in the distance stopped her cold. Distant, but growing steadily closer. Hazel grabbed the satchel and slung Coda's arm over her shoulders. "Can you walk?" "I'll try." She hauled him upright with an effort that made her back scream in protest, and the baby shift uncomfortably inside her. Coda staggered, his weight dragging on her shoulders, but she locked her knees and started moving. They went deeper into the canyon, following the twists and turns of the dry wash, leaving a trail of scuffed sand and scattered blood drops they couldn't afford to hide. By midday, the heat was crushing. They heard riders behind them, voices calling the clatter of hooves on stone. Hazel pushed Coda into the narrow shadow beneath a massive boulder and crouched beside him, one hand pressed to her belly, where the baby kicked and shifted restlessly. Coda's hand covered hers, hot and trembling with exhaustion and blood loss, and she looked up to find him watching her with those dark, steady eyes. "If we're caught," he said quietly, "they'll kill me. You they might spare." Hazel shook her head. "Not if they know what I carry." Coda glanced at the satchel, then back at her face. "What is it?" "Proof, a ledger. Names, payments, a map showing what they've done. Everything Pike and Lemaire want buried." Coda's jaw tightened, and something fierce flickered in his eyes. "Then we don't get caught." That night, as the temperature plummeted with the brutal swiftness of the desert, Hazel and Coda huddled together under a granite overhang, barely large enough to shelter them both. The cold wind bit through their clothes, and Hazel pressed against Coda's side, not seeking comfort, but sharing warmth out of pure necessity. He shifted to shield her from the worst of the wind, and their boots nearly touched in the confined space. She could feel the rise and fall of his chest against her shoulder, the rhythm gradually slowing and steadying as his body fought to recover. "If I sleep too deeply, kick me awake," she said. "I need to stay alert." Coda didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the beaded necklace at his throat, a strip of worn leather, threaded with small blue and white beads, in a traditional pattern, and carefully untied it. He tied it around her wrist with deliberate movements, his fingers brushing her skin. The gesture carried weight, a wordless promise. "We're bound now. Your survival is mine. If you fall, I fall." Hazel looked at the necklace resting against her wrist, then up at him. His eyes were steady, clear, with no regret and no fear visible in their dark depths. Just acceptance of what they'd become to each other. She nodded slowly and settled against him, closing her eyes. They slept in shifts, waking to every sound, every shift of wind, every distant echo that might be hoofbeats or gunfire. And when dawn painted the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold, they moved again, going deeper into the stone labyrinth, staying one step ahead of the men who hunted them. The gunshot shattered the morning quiet like breaking glass. The bullet struck sandstone inches from Hazel's head, and she flinched violently, nearly losing her balance on the narrow ledge they were traversing. Rock shards exploded outward, one catching her cheek and drawing a thin line of blood. Coda shoved her sideways with sudden strength, and she stumbled into the deeper shadow of an overhang, just as a second shot kicked up dust and gravel exactly where she'd been standing. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard it hurt. She pressed her back flat against the rock, breathing hard, and looked up toward the canyon rim. 3 riders sat silhouetted against the bright sky, Whiskey Tom. Lean and wiry, with a face scarred by old knife fights, and 2 others she didn't recognize. Tom held a rifle, the barrel glinting in the sunlight. Coda was already moving despite his wound. He grabbed the Winchester 1873 rifle slung across his back, worked the lever to chamber a round with a smooth, practiced motion, and brought it to his shoulder. The rifle cracked, the sound echoing off the stone walls, and one of the riders toppled backward off his horse with a choked cry, his body crashing into the scrub brush on the slope. Whiskey Tom and the remaining rider wheeled their mounts and disappeared behind the ridge. But Hazel knew they'd circle back. They always did. Tom was known for his persistence. It was why he collected more bounties than anyone else in 3 territories. Coda lowered the rifle slowly, his face gone gray with pain and effort. Hazel saw the dark stain spreading across the bandage she'd tied that morning, blood seeping through the layers of cloth. The exertion had reopened the wound. She moved to his side immediately, pulling her knife to cut fresh strips from what remained of her dress hem. Her hands moved quickly, pressing the cloth against the wound with firm pressure. "Save the baby," she said, her voice tight. She meant herself. Her survival was the baby's survival. But she also meant the ledger hidden in her satchel, the proof they both needed to survive this. Coda's hand closed around her wrist, gentle but unmistakably firm. His eyes found hers and held them. "Both," he said simply. Not a suggestion. A vow. Hazel looked up at him and felt something shift inside her chest, something she didn't have time to examine or name. She nodded and finished tying the bandage, her fingers working with practiced efficiency, despite the tremor she couldn't quite suppress. "We need water," she said. "You're losing too much blood. You'll die without it." Coda nodded, wincing as the movement pulled at the wound. "There's a seep, 1/2 mile, maybe less, hidden. The riders won't know it." They moved again, slower now, following an animal trail that wound between massive boulders and stands of scrub oak. The sun climbed higher, and the heat pressed down with physical weight. Hazel's dress clung to her back, soaked with sweat, and the baby moved restlessly inside her, shifting and kicking as if protesting the conditions. She kept one hand on her belly, steadying herself, and the other on Coda's arm, supporting as much of his weight as she could manage. The seep was exactly where he'd said it would be, a narrow crack in the living rock, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Water trickled out in a thin, precious stream, pooling in a shallow, natural basin worn smooth by centuries. Hazel knelt carefully, filled the canteen, and helped Coda drink first. He leaned against the rock wall, his eyes half closed with exhaustion, and she wet a cloth, pressing it gently to his forehead and then his throat. Her hand lingered there, fingers checking his pulse, too fast still, but stronger than before. Practical, necessary medical care, but undeniably intimate in the quiet heat and isolation. Their breaths synchronized gradually as they rested, listening for any sound of pursuit. In the stillness, with her hand still resting lightly against his throat and his hand covering hers where it had fallen to rest on her knee, Hazel asked the question that had been building in her mind. "Why did you help my husband? You didn't know him. You didn't owe him anything." Coda opened his eyes and looked at her directly. "The spring is sacred to my people. It has fed the land for generations beyond counting. The mind diverts it, steals it for profit, and the land dies. Your husband listened when I told him this. He wanted to stop it, to make it right. That's rare. Most men in this town look away. And Pike killed him for it." Hazel said, her voice hardening. "Yes." Hazel felt the familiar anger rise in her chest, cold and sharp as a blade. "Then we'll make him pay. We'll make them all pay." Coda studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Together." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. But it felt true, solid, like something that could be built on. They rested until the shadows began to lengthen and the worst heat eased slightly, then moved east toward the prairie where Robert Haskett's farm lay. As they walked, Hazel became increasingly aware of the beaded necklace on her wrist, the way it clicked softly with each movement. A physical reminder of the promise they'd made, the bond that was forming between them, whether they intended it or not. Survive or die together. Meanwhile, back in Red Rock, Josephine Hart slipped into the telegraph office under the innocent pretense of mailing a letter. The clerk, a young man named Timothy, with more enthusiasm than sense, stepped into the back room to fetch stamps from the supply cabinet. Josephine's sharp eyes immediately went to the desk, where a telegram lay half-folded, awaiting transmission. She memorized the words with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to retain information. To Territorial Judge Morrison, stop urgent approval. Requested homestead seizure. Stop unstable security conditions. Stop Sheriff Conrad Pike. Stop. Josephine's jaw tightened with controlled anger. She committed every word to memory and was standing innocently by the window when Timothy returned. She completed her transaction, smiled politely, and left. That evening, she visited Dr. Moore's office just as the sun was setting. Moore was cleaning instruments by lamplight, and he looked up sharply when she entered and closed the door firmly behind her. "Pike's moving faster than we thought," Josephine said without preamble. She recited the telegram word for word. Moore's weathered face darkened. "He's fabricating security concerns to justify seizing the farms. Once he controls the land and the water, he controls everything." "We need to warn Haskett," Josephine said. "And we need to find Hazel Whitcomb. If she's still alive, she's in more danger than she knows." Moore looked out the window at the darkening sky, his expression grim. "She's alive. That woman doesn't give up easy. But we're running out of time." The storm built slowly on the western horizon, great towers of cloud rising like mountains in the sky. Hazel and Coda emerged from the canyon's mouth onto the open prairie just as the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the grassland. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the wind picked up, carrying the metallic scent of rain that had been absent for too many weeks. A wagon appeared on the rutted road, moving at speed, and Hazel tensed instinctively. But Coda's hand touched her arm lightly. Haskett. The wagon pulled up in a spray of dust, and Robert Haskett jumped down, his sun-weathered face tight with worry. Saw 3 riders heading this direction, about 20 minutes behind me. One looked like Whiskey Tom. Get in. Now. Hazel didn't waste time arguing. She helped Coda into the back of the wagon, then climbed in after him, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. Haskett threw canvas and loose straw over them, and the wagon lurched forward, bouncing hard over the uneven road. Under the canvas, pressed close together in the stifling darkness, Hazel braced Coda's shoulder with both hands as the wagon jolted and swayed. She felt him tense with each impact and the wound pulling painfully. His hand found hers where it rested on the rifle they'd brought, and he guided her fingers to the lever mechanism. His palm pressed over hers, warm and rough, with calluses demonstrating the motion. "If riders stop us," he said quietly, his breath close to her ear in the confined space. "Pull this back like this, aim for center mass, and squeeze the trigger. Don't hesitate. Don't aim for arms or legs, you'll miss. Center mass." Hazel nodded, her pulse racing, acutely aware of his hand covering hers, the unexpected gentleness in how he was teaching her. "I understand." Thunder cracked directly overhead, so loud it felt like the sky splitting open. The first drops of rain began to fall, big fat drops that hammered on the canvas above them. Within moments, it became a downpour, the sound deafening. Hazel heard shouts behind them, muffled by the rain and canvas. The wagon lurched faster, Haskett urging the mule to greater speed. Lightning split the sky with brilliant white light that leaked through gaps in the canvas, and almost immediately thunder followed, so close and loud that Hazel felt it in her chest. The posse's horses were spooked by the storm. She could hear their frightened whinnying and the curses of the riders trying to control them. The wagon pulled ahead, the rain now so heavy it was like riding through a waterfall. By the time they reached Haskett's farm, the rain was a solid wall of water, hammering the tin roof of the farmhouse like artillery fire, and turning the yard into a morass of mud. Hazel and Coda stumbled out of the wagon, both of them soaked through and shaking, Coda from blood loss and pain, Hazel from exhaustion and fear. Haskett's wife, Mary, rushed out to help, and together they got Coda into the house. Dr. Moore was already there, his medical bag open on the kitchen table. He must have anticipated they'd come here. He took one look at Coda's blood-soaked bandage and gestured sharply toward the bedroom. "Get him on the bed, now." Hazel helped guide Coda to the narrow bed, and he lay back with a barely suppressed groan. Moore cut away the bandage with quick, efficient movements, and Hazel winced when she saw the wound fully exposed. It was worse than she'd thought. The bullet had done significant damage, tearing muscle and grazing the lower rib. "Hold him," Moore said, his voice calm but firm. "This is going to hurt like hell, and I need him still." Hazel positioned herself at Coda's shoulders, her hands pressing down firmly, her face close to his. "Don't move," she whispered. "Look at me. Just look at me." Coda's hand found hers, his fingers lacing tightly through hers, and he locked his eyes on her face as Moore began to work. She felt the tension spike through his entire body, saw the sweat bead instantly on his forehead, and temples felt his grip tighten until her bones ached. But he didn't cry out, didn't look away from her face. She found herself whispering things she didn't consciously decide to say. "You're all right. Stay with me, breathe, just breathe." and he did, matching his breathing to hers as Moore cleaned and sutured the wound properly. When it was finally done, Hazel cleaned the blood from Coda's skin with a damp cloth, her touch as gentle as she could make it. His eyes were half closed with exhaustion, but he was watching her still. Still breathing. He said, his voice rough. "Good," she replied softly. "Keep doing that." Outside, the storm raged. Through the window, Hazel saw riders circling the property, dark shapes in the rain. Haskett doused the lamps quickly, and the family gathered in the back room. Hazel grabbed the Henry rifle he had carried since the war and moved to the front window, her heart pounding. She saw shadows moving through the rain, heard low voices shouting to each other. Then the sharp crack of a gunshot shattered one of the windows, and Haskett's wife screamed. The chicken coop suddenly burst into flames. Despite the rain, they'd used coal oil to make sure it caught. The fire hissed and spit black smoke billowing. Haskett's 15-year-old daughter, Sarah, grabbed a bucket and ran outside into the rain, despite her mother's cry of protest, dousing the flames, even as bullets tore through the wooden water barrel beside her, spilling precious water into the mud. Haskett cursed viciously and fired back through the window, his rifle loud in the confined space. Hazel aimed carefully at a shadow near the barn and squeezed the trigger. The recoil jarred her shoulder hard, but she saw the shadow fall and not rise. Then light appeared on the road lanterns, many of them, and the sound of more horses. Neighbors alerted by the gunfire, riding up with rifles and shotguns at the ready. Haskett's two closest neighbors, the Johnsons and the Mercers, and several other farmers whose land was also dying for lack of water. The posse hesitated, suddenly outnumbered. Whiskey Tom's voice carried through the rain. "This ain't over, Haskett. You're harboring fugitives. And you're burning honest folks' property on Pike's orders." One of the neighbors shouted back, "Get off this land." The standoff held for a long, tense moment. Then Tom wheeled his horse and shouted a retreat. The riders disappeared into the rain and darkness, and the yard fell silent, except for the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Hazel lowered the rifle, her hands shaking badly now that the immediate danger had passed. Moore appeared at her side, checking her over with practiced efficiency. "You're bleeding." She looked down and saw a shallow cut on her forearm, blood mixing with rain and dirt. She hadn't even felt it happen. "It's nothing." Moore bandaged it anyway, then nodded toward the bedroom where Coda lay. "He needs rest. So do you. You're no good to anyone if you collapse." Hazel returned to the bedroom and sat carefully on the edge of the bed beside Coda. He was asleep now, his breathing deep and more even than before, his face finally relaxed from the constant tension of pain. She found herself reaching out to brush a strand of damp black hair from his forehead, then stopped herself, wondering at the impulse. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat watch with the rifle across her lap, listening to the rain and the occasional rumble of distant thunder, and thought about Teodoro, about Pike, about the ledger sewn into her dress, and about the complicated man lying unconscious beside her, who had become unexpectedly important to her survival. At dawn, the storm broke. Haskett woke them with urgent news. Scouts had reported riders near Dry River, and they were setting up some kind of blockade. If Hazel and Coda were going to move, it had to be now. Hazel helped Coda to his feet, and despite Moore's obvious reluctance to let his patient travel so soon, they climbed into the wagon once more. This time they headed east toward Dry River and whatever waited there. The river had once been a substantial waterway, fed by Elk Eye Spring and the seasonal snowmelt from the distant mountains. But the dam had reduced it to a sad trickle. The wide riverbed, now mostly exposed, cracked mud and scattered stones. As they approached the ford, Hazel heard something that made her blood run cold. A roar, distant but growing rapidly louder. "Flash flood!" Haskett shouted. "Hang on!" The wall of water hit before they could react. The wagon tipped violently, spilling its passengers into the sudden torrent. Hazel felt the icy shock of the water close over her head, felt herself tumbling in the current, unable to tell which way was up. Her lungs screamed for air. Then strong hands grabbed her arm, hauling her toward the surface. Coda pulled her toward a snag of driftwood lodged against a boulder, and they clung to it as debris battered past them, branches, an entire uprooted tree, what looked like part of a fence. The current was terrifyingly strong, trying to tear them away. Coda braced his arm across Hazel's chest, anchoring them both to the snag. Her pregnant belly pressed against his forearm, and she felt him shift lower, using his body to shield her from the worst of the debris. A heavy branch struck his back hard enough to make him grunt in pain, but his grip on her never wavered. Another piece of debris, a broken wagon wheel, spun past, inches from her head. Hazel clung to him, her fingers digging desperately into his shirt, feeling the raw strength in his grip, even weakened as he was by blood loss and injury. The water was so cold it burned, and she couldn't stop shaking. Finally, mercifully, the worst of the flood passed. The water level began to drop as quickly as it had risen. Coda and Hazel dragged themselves onto the far bank, gasping and coughing up river water, their clothes plastered to their bodies, both of them shaking violently. Coda held her until her breathing matched his slow, steady, deliberate. Then he pulled her carefully to her feet, and they stumbled onward, following the river toward where Haskett had already pulled the wagon out on the far side. The hayloft at Haskett's barn smelled of dust, old straw, and the sweet scent of dried grass. The air was thick and warm, despite the rain still pattering on the roof outside. Hazel sat on an upturned crate, her hands trembling slightly, as she worked her knife carefully through the stitches in her dress hem. Coda lay nearby on a pile of blankets Mary Haskett had brought, finally sleeping soundly after Moore had checked his sutures and pronounced him healing better than expected miraculously. Dr. Moore stood at the loft's small window, watching the road approach with the vigilance of a man who'd lived through too many surprises. His rifle leaned against the wall within easy reach. Hazel pulled the ledger free from its hiding place, the leather cover stained and worn edges soft with age and handling. She opened it carefully on her lap, and Moore moved closer to look over her shoulder. The pages were filled with Teodoro's meticulous script. She'd know his handwriting anywhere neat and precise as everything he did. Names, dates, amounts in dollars and cents. Every bribe Pike and Lemaire had made, every payment to ensure the water kept flowing to the mine instead of the farms. Each entry was damning. But it was the last page that made her breath catch. Folded carefully and tucked into the binding was a hand-drawn map. A detailed rendering of the canyon system with trails marked, landmarks noted, and at the center marked with a red triangle, overflow cavern, true source. And beneath it, in Teodoro's careful hand, Kay showed me where to find it. Must tell Moore. But careful Pike was listening at the window when I spoke with Yates. Don't know if he heard everything. Cannot trust anyone until we have proof. The words hit Hazel like a physical blow. She read the note again, her mind racing. Pike was listening, she said aloud, when Teodoro spoke with Silas Yates about the spring. Moore's face darkened. Yates, I should have known. That nervous, twitchy bastard. He's been Pike's eyes and ears in town all along. Hazel felt cold despite the warmth of the loft. Yates knew everything. Who was asking questions, who might be sympathetic. He's been feeding information to Pike. Which means, Moore said grimly, Pike knows you've been asking about the ledger. He knows you've talked to me, to Josephine, to Haskett. He knows you're building a case. The door at the bottom of the ladder creaked, and Josephine slipped inside, rain dripping from her shawl. She held a thin strip of paper, a telegraph message, and her face was pale. I broke into the telegraph office again after Timothy left for supper, she said, climbing the ladder with quick efficiency. This came through 2 hours ago, marked urgent. She handed the paper to Moore, who read it aloud, his voice tight with controlled anger, to Territorial Judge Morrison. Stop homestead seizure approved. Stop take possession of eastern properties immediately. Stop authority granted. Stop. Hazel's jaw clenched so hard it ached. He's stealing the farms, all of them. Haskett's land specifically, Moore confirmed. And the Johnson place, the Mercers, probably half a dozen others. Once he controls the land and the water, he can set whatever prices he wants. The farmers who remain will be working for him. Josephine nodded, her expression fierce. He's not just a corrupt sheriff. He's building an empire. Hazel held up the ledger, the damning evidence of everything Pike had done. We have the proof, but we need Coda to testify. He's the only living witness who can confirm the location of the true spring and verify that Pike knew about the theft. Coda stirred at the sound of his name, his eyes opening. He sat up slowly, wincing, and looked at the three of them. What's wrong? Hazel knelt beside him, the ledger open in her lap. She showed him the note, pointing to the reference to K. You told my husband where to find the spring, the real source, the overflow cavern. And Pike was eavesdropping. That's why he killed Teodoro, to silence him before he could speak at the town meeting. Coda's face hardened, his jaw setting. I told your husband the canyon has two hearts, an upper spring that feeds the lower. I showed him the hidden entrance to the overflow cavern. I didn't know Pike was there. I didn't know someone was listening. Yates, Hazel said bitterly. He was the leak. He told Pike everything. Coda's hand curled into a fist. Then Yates is as guilty as Pike. We'll deal with him, Moore said. But first, we need to move. If Pike knows you're here, and thanks to Yates, he probably does, he'll come with everything he's got. But before they could organize a departure, Haskett burst through the barn door, below his face ashen and his voice tight with panic. They took Jacob. Whiskey Tom rode up with 2 men and grabbed my boy at the well. Says he'll trade him for the Lakota, 1 for 1. Hazel's blood turned to ice. She looked at Coda and saw him already standing, reaching for his shirt, despite the way the movement pulled painfully at his healing wound. I'll go, Coda said simply. No, Hazel said sharply. You're still hurt. They'll kill you the moment they have you. Coda looked at her, his dark eyes steady and resigned. Then they'll kill the boy, a child, 12 years old. I won't let that happen. Hazel wanted to argue, wanted to find another way, but she knew with sinking certainty that he was right. Tom would kill Jacob without hesitation if his demands weren't met. Not like this, she said, her voice fierce. Not while you're wounded and they're waiting for you. But Coda pulled free of her restraining hand and walked toward the ladder, moving with the deliberate care of someone who knew exactly how much his body could and couldn't do. Hazel grabbed the rifle and followed, her heart pounding with fear and fury. The yard was a sea of mud churned by the storm puddles reflecting the gray sky. Rain had eased to a steady drizzle, but the ground was treacherous, sucking at boots with every step. Whiskey Tom stood near the well, mounted on a rangy gray horse, one hand gripping the collar of young Jacob Haskett. The boy was pale and shaking, trying hard not to cry, his eyes wide with terror. Tom held a pistol, the barrel pressed against Jacob's temple. That's far enough, Tom called out, his scarred face splitting in a grin that showed missing teeth. You're worth $700 now, Lakota. Pike raised the bounty after you killed one of my men. Dead or alive, he said. I prefer dead, less trouble, but I'll take you breathing if you come quiet. Coda walked forward slowly, his hands raised and empty. He'd left the rifle behind. Hazel stood at the barn door with a Henry in her hands, her finger on the trigger, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. But Jacob was too close to Tom. She couldn't risk the shot. "Let the boy go," Coda said, his voice carrying clearly across the muddy yard. "Not yet. Not until you're tied up proper." Coda stopped 10 paces away. "Your word. Let him go and I'll come willingly." Tom's grin widened. "Sure, my word." Then he holstered his pistol, shoved Jacob roughly toward the house, and pulled a heavy wooden club from his saddle. Before anyone could react, he swung it in a vicious arc, and the club cracked across Coda's skull with a sound that made Hazel's stomach turn. Coda went down hard, crumpling into the mud. Tom kicked him viciously in the ribs, and Hazel saw Coda curl around. And the blow saw the dark stain spreading from his wound where the stitches had torn. Tom grabbed Coda by his long black hair, dragging him toward his horse. Hazel raised the rifle, her vision narrowing to the sight picture, her finger tightening on the trigger. But Tom was using Coda as a shield now, and the other 2 riders had their guns drawn, scanning for threats. "Tell Pike I got him," Tom shouted to his companions. "Let's move before those farmers grow a spine." Moore grabbed Hazel's arm hard, stopping her from running after them. "Not like this," he said urgently. "You'll get yourself killed and then the baby dies too. We have to be smart." Hazel lowered the rifle, her hands shaking with rage and helplessness. She watched Tom and his men drag Coda's semi-conscious body across a saddle and ride toward the canyon road, heading west. She turned to Haskett, her voice cold and flat. "Hide the ledger. Put it somewhere Pike won't find it, even if he tears this place apart. If we don't come back, get it to the territorial judge. Promise me." Haskett nodded grimly. "I promise." He took the ledger and the telegraph strip, moving toward the house. Hazel knew he had a seed chest in the cellar. With a false bottom, it would have to be enough. Josephine grabbed Hazel's arm. "I'll go to the telegraph office. I'll send a message claiming the wires are down, delay the homestead seizure order. Buy you time." Hazel pulled her into a quick, fierce embrace. "Thank you. For everything." Moore handed Hazel a scarlet scarf, faded but sturdy. "Wrap your belly as tight as you can stand. The ride to Copper Gulch is rough, and if they took Coda there, we're going to have to move fast and hard." Hazel took the scarf and wrapped it around her pregnant belly, tying it securely. She felt the baby shift and kick in protest, but the support helped. She touched the beaded necklace still on her wrist, Coda's necklace, and felt its weight settle against her skin like an anchor. Before they left, Moore gave Josephine clear, detailed instructions. "If we don't return by dawn, and I mean first light, not mid-morning, you gather every man you trust. Johnson, Mercer, anyone who'll come. You take them to the Elk Eye Overflow Cavern. It's marked on the map in the ledger. That's where this will end one way or another. That's where Pike will make his final stand." Josephine's face was pale but determined. "I'll be ready, and I'll bring the ledger so the judge can verify everything." They mounted up Moore on his steady bay gelding, Hazel on a borrowed mare that Haskett swore was gentle. The horses were already tired, but there was no choice. They had to move. They rode hard through the afternoon and into the evening, following the tracks left by Tom's party. The trail led west toward Copper Gulch Mine. The sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, and Hazel felt every jolt and bounce in her spine and belly. But she gritted her teeth and kept going because Coda was out there somewhere, hurt and captive, and she'd be damned if she'd abandon him now. Not after everything. Not after what they'd become to each other. By full dark, they reached Copper Gulch. The mine sprawled across the hillside like an open wound, stamp mills pounding away, even at night, powered by the diverted water from Elk-Eye Spring. Sluices ran with precious water that should have been feeding farms. The whole operation stank of sulfur and greed. Hazel dismounted carefully, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Moore handed her the rifle and pointed toward a squat building at the edge of the operation. Pump house. That's where they'd keep a prisoner isolated, easy to guard, and the noise of the water covers any sounds. Hazel's jaw tightened. She moved forward in a low crouch, keeping to the shadows, her heart pounding. The pump house sat at the yard's edge, a crude structure with corrugated metal roof. Inside, she could hear the roar of water being forced through pipes under pressure, the sound deafening even through the walls. She circled to the back and found the main pump line, a thick pipe feeding water from the diversion channel. She pulled her knife and began sawing at the leather gasket, where sections joined. It took agonizing minutes, but finally the seal gave way. Pressure built immediately behind the damaged section, and the sound changing, rising to a high-pitched whine. The door burst open, and a guard stepped out to investigate. Hazel swung the crowbar Moore had given her a tool from his wagon and caught the man across the temple. He went down hard and didn't move. She slipped inside. The interior was dim lit by a single lantern and dominated by the massive pump mechanism. Lakota was bound to a support post, his arms pulled behind him, his head hanging. Blood dripped from his nose and a cut above his eye, and his shirt was torn, revealing dark bruises on his ribs. "Lakota," Hazel whispered urgently, moving to him. His head lifted, and his eyes found hers, dazed but aware. "Hazel." She cut his bonds quickly with her knife, and he slumped forward. She caught him as best she could, her pregnant belly making it awkward, but she managed to keep him upright. Another guard appeared in the doorway, and Lakota, moving on pure instinct and training despite his injuries, shoulder-checked the man hard into the metal wall. The guard's head hit with a sickening clang, and he dropped. "We have to go," Hazel said. "Now." They fled as the pump line burst completely behind them, water exploding outward in a high-pressure jet that flooded the yard. Chaos erupted, men shouting, running for cover, trying to shut down systems before the whole operation flooded. But Whiskey Tom and his men were already mounting up, and Sheriff Pike appeared on horseback near the mine office, shouting orders. His eyes locked on Hazel and Lakota, and his face twisted with rage. "Canyon, the spring move," Pike bellowed. Hazel and Lakota ran for the horses. Moore provided covering fire, and they mounted up, riding hard toward Elk-Eye Canyon. The posse thundered after them, and the final confrontation drew near. The canyon opened before them like the entrance to hell itself, the walls steep and shadowed in the last light of dusk. The sun had set behind the western mountains, leaving only a fading orange glow that painted the stone in shades of rust and blood. Hazel and Lakota dismounted at the canyon mouth, the horses too exhausted to go further. Their sides heaved, foam flecked on their necks, and Moore quickly led them aside where they wouldn't be in the line of fire. They proceeded on foot, moving as quickly as Lakota's injuries would allow. Moore took point, his rifle ready, leading them along a narrow trail that wound deeper into the stone labyrinth. The air grew cooler as they descended, and Hazel could hear water running somewhere ahead and the sound of Elk-Eye Spring in its natural course before Pike's Dam had choked it. The overflow cavern was half a mile in, hidden behind a natural curtain of rock that made it invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Lakota led them to it, despite his injuries, his knowledge of the land absolute. The spring bubbled up from deep underground, emerging in a wide pool within the cavern, before flowing out through a natural channel that wound down through the canyon. But Pike had built his dam here, crude but effective logs and stones stacked high, blocking the natural channel and diverting the water north toward the mine. "There," Lakota said, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. Destroy that dam and the water flows back to the farms like it's supposed to. Hazel nodded, studying the structure. It would take time to dismantle time they might not have. But it was the physical proof they needed, evidence of the theft. Then she heard hoofbeats behind them, echoing off the stone walls. She turned and saw riders emerging from the canyon's shadows. Pike Lemaire, Whiskey Tom, and 5 armed men, all with guns drawn. Pike's face was twisted with rage, his expensive suit spattered with mud, and his usual composure shattered. "End of the line," he snarled. "No escape this time, no witnesses. I'll bury you both in this canyon, and no one will ever find the bodies." Hazel and Coda backed toward the cavern mouth, where a narrow ledge ran along the wall above the churning water below. The spring's overflow had created a deep channel, and the drop from the ledge was 20 feet to the rocky stream. The ledge itself was barely wide enough for one person, slick from constant spray, and the wind howled through the canyon, making balance treacherous. Coda pulled a strip of rawhide from his belt. With his good hand and the other arm hung useless, injured in the beating Tom had given him. He looped the rawhide around his own waist, then handed the other end to Hazel. "Tie this around you. Go first. If you slip, I can hold you." Hazel looked at the narrow, treacherous ledge, then at him. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "If I slip, you can't haul me back up. Not injured like you are. Not with—" She gestured at her pregnant belly. Coda's jaws set with stubborn determination. "Then don't slip." Hazel tied the rawhide around her waist with trembling fingers, then turned to face the ledge. She took a deep breath, placed her hand flat against the cold stone wall, and stepped out onto the narrow path. The stone was slippery wet from constant spray. Her boots struggled for purchase. She pressed her face against the rock, her breaths coming fast and shallow, trying to stay calm for the baby's sake. Every muscle in her body was tense, her fingers finding tiny holds in the stone. The water roared below her, white and violent, and the wind tried to push her off balance. Behind her, she felt Coda step onto the ledge. His hand pressed flat against her back, not pushing but ready to catch her if she started to fall. The warmth of his palm through her wet dress was steadying, grounding her. "Slow," he said quietly. "Small steps. Don't look down." "Stop them." Pike's voice echoed off the stone walls. Alphonse Lemaire raised his rifle, an expensive hunting piece with brass fittings, and took careful aim. Not at Coda, but at Hazel, at her pregnant belly. "Shoot her, and the ledger reaches the judge by morning." Hazel shouted, pulling the folded telegraph strip and one page from the ledger from inside her dress. She held them high, the papers fluttering in the wind. "Moore has copies. Josephine has copies. Kill us, and you're still finished." Pike sneered, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now. "You're bluffing. You've got nothing." "Try me," Hazel said coldly. Then voices echoed from behind Pike's group, and lanterns appeared on the trail. Moore, Josephine Haskett, and 6 other farmers appeared, all armed, all with faces set in grim determination. Josephine held the ledger, and Moore had the complete map. "Not today, Pike." Moore said, his voice hard as iron. "It's over. The judge has the evidence. The territorial marshal is on his way. You're finished." Pike's face went purple with rage. "Like hell I am." The pump flood from the mine had followed them down the canyon, and now the surge hit the cavern, a wall of water that rose rapidly chest deep on the horses, climbing higher by the second. The animals panicked, rearing and screaming. Pike fired wildly, the shot going high and wide. Coda shifted in front of Hazel, shielding her body with his own. A second shot from Tom caught Coda in his already injured arm, and blood sprayed hot across Hazel's face. She felt him stagger, felt his hand slip from her back. "No." Hazel spun, bringing up the Henry rifle she'd somehow kept with her. She fired the recoil, jolting her shoulder. The bullet caught Pike in the shoulder, spinning him off his horse into the rising water. Haskett clubbed Lemaire across the back of the head with his rifle stock, and the superintendent toppled into the flood, flailing and choking. Tom tried to wheel his horse and flee, but the animal slipped on the wet stone and went down, throwing him hard. Moore and 2 farmers were on him instantly, binding his hands. Hazel and Coda stumbled forward off the ledge onto solid ground on the far side. Coda collapsed against the cavern wall, his breathing harsh and ragged, blood streaming from his arm. Hazel dropped to her knees beside him, pressing both hands against the wound, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me," she said, her voice shaking. "Don't you dare die on me now, not after everything. Stay with me." Coda looked at her, his dark eyes fierce despite the pain. "Still breathing," he managed. "Good," Hazel said, tears streaming down her face, mixing with rain and spray. "Don't stop. Don't you dare stop." Moore appeared at her side with his medical bag, and together they worked to bind Coda's arm properly. The chaos slowly resolved around them. Pike and Lemaire were bound secured by ropes and watched by armed farmers. Tom was unconscious, but alive. The water began to recede as the flood surge passed. It was over. By lantern light in the overflow cavern, with the sound of running water echoing off stone walls, Josephine spread the ledger pages carefully on a flat rock surface. She'd brought her portable telegraph key and battery, and her fingers moved with practiced speed, clicking out message after message to the circuit judge in dry bones. Names, dates, amounts, testimony from Moore and Haskett. A sworn statement from Coda, his mark made with his left hand, since his right was bound and useless. Every piece of evidence transmitted methodically and completely. Within an hour, a response came back. Territorial Marshal dispatched. Stop arrest. Warrants issued. Pike Lemaire. Tom Yates. Stop hold prisoners. Stop evidence accepted. Stop Yates. So the storekeeper's betrayal was confirmed and recorded. Hazel felt a grim satisfaction at that. Pike and Lemaire were trussed securely and loaded into Haskett's wagon for transport to Red Rock to await the marshal. Tom regained consciousness and immediately began trying to negotiate, offering to testify against Pike in exchange for leniency. Moore ignored him. Coda couldn't ride. His injuries were too severe, the blood loss too much. Hazel and Moore fashioned a travois from branches and canvas, tying it to Moore's steady horse. They loaded Coda onto it as gently as they could, and Hazel walked beside it the entire way back to Red Rock, one hand on his shoulder, steadying him when the ground was rough. When pain made him gasp and tense, she counted breaths with him. Breathe in 2, 3, 4. Breathe out 2, 3, 4. And he focused on her voice, syncing his breathing to hers. And when contractions hit her sharp and sudden, brought on by stress and exhaustion, Coda braced her back with his good hand, counting breaths for her at the same way, their rhythm matching and steadying each other. They reached Red Rock by noon the following day. The territorial marshal was already there, a hard-faced man named Morrison, who took custody of Pike Lemaire and Tom without ceremony. Silas Yates was arrested trying to flee town with 2 packed saddlebags. Apparently, he'd been planning to run the moment he heard Pike had been captured. Maximilian Vorst, the mine's bookkeeper and scribe, tried to claim the ledger was a forgery. But Josephine methodically matched entries to bank drafts seized from Pike's office and from the mine's own records. Vorst's protests died quickly when threatened with charges of conspiracy. Judge Morrison reviewed the evidence and issued immediate orders. The dam at Elkeye Spring was to be dismantled completely. Water rights were to be restored to their natural flow. The mine's diversion was illegal and must cease immediately. Farmers gathered with shovels, axes, and bare determination. They were joined by some of the mine workers' men who'd been following orders, but weren't complicit in the theft and by remorseful townsmen who turned blind eyes for too long. By evening, the dam was rubble, and Elk Eye Spring ran clear and strong down its natural channel toward Red Rock and the farms beyond. But Hazel's labor started that night. She'd been holding on by sheer stubborn will, adrenaline, and necessity, keeping her body functioning beyond its limits. But as the danger passed and exhaustion finally crashed over her, her body gave way. The contractions that had been sporadic and manageable suddenly intensified, coming faster and harder. Moore carried her to the schoolhouse where Josephine and Mary Haskett had prepared a makeshift birthing room. Coda, his right arm bound in a sling and his face still pale from blood loss, refused to leave despite Moore's protests. "I stay," he said simply, and the finality in his voice ended the argument. The labor was long, brutal, and terrifying. Hazel had heard other women's stories, but nothing prepared her for the reality. Pain that felt like being torn apart from the inside. Fear that something was wrong, that the baby wouldn't survive, that she wouldn't survive. But Coda stayed at her shoulder the entire time. He soaked cloths in cool water and pressed them to her forehead when fever spiked. He held her hand when contractions peaked, and she squeezed so hard she left nail marks in his skin. He didn't flinch. He counted breaths with her, his voice steady and calm, anchoring her when everything else was chaos and pain. And when she screamed, because she couldn't help it, the pain was too much. He leaned close and whispered, "You're stronger than anyone I've ever known. You can do this. Breathe with me." Dawn was breaking pale light, filtering through the schoolhouse windows when the baby finally came. A daughter small and red-faced and wailing with powerful lungs that promised she'd be a force to reckon with. Moore cleaned her quickly and efficiently wrapped her in a clean quilt Mary had brought and placed her on Hazel's chest. Hazel stared down at the tiny, perfect face eyes squeezed shut, mouth open in outrage, and felt something break open inside her chest. All the fear, the grief, the anger, the exhaustion transformed in an instant into fierce protective love. Tears streamed down her face unchecked. "She's perfect," Hazel whispered. Coda leaned over his good hand, cradling the baby's impossibly small head with infinite gentleness. He pulled the buckskin sash from his waist, traditional work, beaded by his mother years ago, and wrapped it carefully around the child, swaddling her in his heritage as much as in cloth. "You both breathe," he said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "So I will." Hazel looked up at him, at this man who'd become so much more than an ally, more than a companion in survival. Something had formed between them in the canyons, and the danger something real and solid, built on trust and shared hardship, and the instinct to protect each other at any cost. She reached up with her free hand and touched his face, her palm against his scarred cheek. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Coda covered her hand with his dark eyes holding hers. "We survived together," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact, of commitment. "We build together." Hazel smiled, real and full for the first time in months. "Yes." 3 weeks passed in a blur of recovery and reconstruction. The Territorial Circuit Court convened in Red Rock with Judge Morrison presiding. The trial was swift and decisive, the evidence overwhelming. The Ledger, the Telegraph records, the statements from Moore and Haskett, and a dozen farmers' Coda's testimony as witness to the spring's true location, and Pike's knowledge of the theft, it all added up to a conviction that was never in doubt. Conrad Pike was sentenced to 20 years hard labor in the Territorial Prison. Alphonse Lemaire received 15 years. Whiskey Tom, charged with assault, kidnapping, and attempted murder, got 8 years. Silas Yates, convicted of conspiracy and espionage, received 5 years and was banned from ever holding business in the territory again. The verdicts were met with grim satisfaction by the townspeople who'd suffered under Pike's corruption. No celebration, but relief. Justice delivered clearly and finally. Judge Morrison issued additional orders, and the mine at Copper Gulch was to cease all water diversion immediately and was placed under territorial oversight. The stamp mills could continue operating, but only using water legally purchased or recycled. The company owning the mine was fined $20,000 to be distributed among the farmers whose land had been damaged. The dam at Elk Spring remained dismantled. Water flowed freely down its natural course, and within 2 weeks, the ditches were running full again. Haskett's fields began to recover the cracked earth, softening and greening. Other farms followed. Children played in the running water laughing, and their parents watched with expressions of profound relief. Josephine Hart was officially appointed telegraph deputy by the Territorial Communications Office in recognition of her skill and her role in breaking the case. She continued teaching at the schoolhouse now with official funding and a salary that actually paid. But Judge Morrison had one final ruling to deliver, and it was this that changed everything. He called a formal assembly in Red Rock's largest building, the church hall, with seating for 100 and standing room beyond that. Farmers, townspeople, mine workers, and Coda's small Lakota band all gathered. The judge stood at the front with documents spread before him. "I have reviewed the original land survey and water rights for this region," Morrison announced, his voice carrying clearly. "Based on testimony from Coda of the Lakota people and corroborated by geological surveys and historical records, I make the following determination. The overflow cavern at Elk Spring, being the true and original source of the water that feeds this region, is determined to be Lakota tribal water by right of original use and by treaty law established in 1851. However, recognizing that the farms of Red Rock have also depended on this water for their survival for 2 decades, and that cooperation benefits all parties, I hereby authorize the creation of a joint trust. The Lakota Band and the farmers of Red Rock shall co-manage Elk Spring. A board of trustees shall be established with equal representation. Water rights shall be shared equitably. The farms shall pay an annual grain tax, 10% of harvest, which shall fund the establishment and operation of a medical clinic and a school serving both communities." A moment of stunned silence, then voices rose in questions and discussion. But gradually, as people absorbed the implications, the mood shifted to cautious approval. Gray Elk, an elder of the Lakota Band, who'd traveled 2 days to be present, stood and spoke in his language. Coda translated, his voice steady. "The water is sacred. It is meant to feed life, not greed. This trust honors that. We accept." Haskett stood as well, looking around at his fellow farmers. "We've been dying for years because of Pike's theft. This gives us life, gives us partnership. I say we accept." One by one, the others nodded agreement. Papers were signed. Hazel witnessed the ceremony, standing at the back of the hall with her daughter Clara, named for Hazel's mother, sleeping in her arms, wrapped in Coda's buckskin sash. Coda stood beside her, his injured arm still in a sling, but healing well, and he stepped forward when called to make his mark on the document. An X, firm and clear, witnessed by the judge. Morrison handed him a copy of the ruling, and Coda folded it carefully. Later, back at the small cabin Haskett had offered them temporarily, he placed the document in the seed chest that had once hidden the ledger, the same chest that now served as a cradle for Clara, lined with soft quilts. That evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and purple over the prairie, Hazel and Coda walked to the edge of town where the irrigation ditches ran full and strong. The sound of running water was constant now, a low music that promised life and growth. Farmers called greetings as they passed, tipping hats, offering smiles and nods of respect. Children played in the fields, their voices bright with joy. Everything felt different, lighter, cleaner, like a wound that had finally begun to heal. Hazel glanced at Coda, their shoulders nearly touching as they walked. "Well, what will you do now? Stay or return to your band?" Coda was quiet for a moment, looking out at the horizon where the last light was fading. "I'll stay," he said finally. "Help manage the trust. Make sure the water flows fairly. Make sure no one tries to steal it again." He paused, then added quietly, "If you want me to stay." Hazel stopped walking and turned to face him fully. In the fading light, his face was half in shadow, the scar on his shoulder just visible where his shirt had shifted. She thought about everything they'd been through together, the fear, the pain, the desperate race for survival. She thought about the way he'd protected her, taught her counted breaths with her through labor. The way he'd wrapped Clara in his sash, claiming her as someone to be protected and honored. "I want you to stay," she said clearly. "I want us to build something together. A life, a home, for Clara and for us." Coda's expression softened in a way she'd never seen before, and he reached out to take her hand, his rough, calloused fingers threading through hers. "Then I'll stay. For as long as you'll have me." Hazel stepped closer, and he wrapped his good arm around her carefully, and they stood there as the light faded completely, and the stars began to appear bright and sharp in the clear desert sky. No epilogue stretching into distant futures. No mysterious riders on horizons suggesting sequels. No loose ends or unanswered questions. Just two people who'd survived the worst together, standing at the beginning of something new. The water flowed and the land healed, and the promise of dawn held steady. Clara stirred in her cradle back at the cabin, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. Life continued hard and beautiful and real in the Wild West of 1873. Together, they'd made it possible.